I'd like to teach you how to fully disassemble, clean, and reassemble your airbrush gun. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there might be something jammed up in one of the many little parts inside this airbrush that you can't get to. And the good thing is we can disassemble it almost to nothing so that you can clean every part individually. So we're gonna go ahead and lay it out in the order of disassembly so that when it's time to put it back together, you can visually see where you started, where you ended, and work backwards. So we've already sprayed all of the excess makeup out of the airbrush at this point, and we've already done a quick clean. So now it's time to take it apart. The first thing we're gonna do is remove the tail cap at the end. You will notice there's a hole in this tail cap. The reason for that is so that you can tighten and loosen the needle chucking nut for effects purposes. If you're an effects artist, sometimes having that needle loose in the nozzle area will help you get spatter effects. So we're gonna go ahead and remove the tail cap. And then we're gonna remove the actual needle chucking nut. This is what keeps this needle very solid in the airbrush. If it's loose, when you pull the trigger back, it will not pull the needle back. If it's tight and you pull the trigger back, you'll see the needle move. So we need to make sure it's always tight so that we open up the front of the airbrush. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the needle. And I'm gonna wipe that down with the tissue, and I'm gonna test it for any hooks in the end of the needle by dragging it along my fingertip while spinning it. I feel no hooks, we're good to go. If there were hooks in the needle, it would mean time to replace your needle. You might see some spitting when it starts spraying the makeup, and it's just an irregular spray pattern at that point. Okay, so we've taken the needle chucking nut off completely. Now we're getting to the needle casing. Be careful when you're disassembling this because there are some extra parts inside here that will jump out at you. Again, a very good idea to do this over a table. Go ahead and unscrew all the way, and we're gonna remove the casing. And then the spring pops right out. And then you'll notice there's a part here that has a tongue-looking attachment behind the trigger. It's kind of floppy. You'll need to actually angle it upwards and push down on the attachment behind the trigger so that you can pull it out. And I do check the hole right here because if there is any makeup at the opening, you will want to clean that out. And this is a good time for me to talk about how you would do that, which is why I recommend having the TEMPTU airbrush cleaning kit on hand, because we do actually include some small spoolie brushes to get into these nooks and crannies that are a little bit smaller. And so you can actually put a little cleaner on there and very carefully feed the spoolie brush through each part. Generally, you won't see makeup all the way in the back of the airbrush like this, but just in case you do, you have the parts to take care of it. Now we're left with this trigger, okay? The trigger, just so you know, is going to be seated directly above the air stem. There are two notches that the trigger sits in. So yes, it'll wobble back and forth, but it won't slide back and forth because it's actually sitting in notches. So you're gonna lift up out of the notches, give it a quarter turn, and pull it out. And you'll see the two little studs on the bottom there. We're gonna lay that down. And now you're done with the disassembly of the back of the airbrush. So go ahead and turn it needle end up, and let's go ahead and start taking apart at the top. This is called the needle cap. This part right here, the needle cap, is going to protect your needle in case it gets dropped. It's also going to dictate the spray pattern that comes out of the airbrush. So this is the stock needle cap that comes on the airbrush, which makes a circular pattern when the makeup comes out of the airbrush. I mentioned that in the case, there's a spare one that's more of a crown shape. And that's for a more artistic starburst pattern. So we'll go ahead and lay down the needle cap. Underneath the needle cap is what we call the nozzle cap. Now, a caution here. When you're unscrewing this, be very careful because underneath it, what we are exposing is a very fragile part of the airbrush gun. So when you unscrew it, lift straight up to expose the nozzle. Okay. Now I am checking all of these pieces as I take them apart to make sure that they don't need to be cleaned. If they do need to be cleaned, grab your cleaner, your cleaning brush, and get to work. All right, now you've got your nozzle. The nozzle is a very small, soft metal. It's copper, so it can bend or break a little too much if you use too much elbow grease. Well, how do we get this out of the airbrush? That funny looking little wrench that comes in the box. It has a little rectangular notch which slides in along the base of the nozzle, and you're going to give it a quick turn to loosen it, and then do the rest by hand over a table. So I'm going to unscrew that, set the airbrush down, and now we are left with this tiny little nozzle, and I'm holding it with tweezers. There is a black gasket that goes around the threading of this nozzle, which means that you don't have to over tighten it when you are putting it back on the airbrush, because that gasket will seal it closed. So do not over tighten this when you put it back. But what I like to do is actually hold it up to the light, and you can actually see the pinhole. If you don't see the pinhole, then that means that it could potentially be clogged with makeup. Or if you did something that I recommend you don't do, which is clean with a Q-tip, you could potentially see Q-tip fibers stuck in this nozzle, which create a very big blockage. So again, another reason not to use Q-tips and only clean with a brush. If you do need to clean inside this little nozzle, I recommend putting a little cleaner on your brush and gently sticking a few of the bristles of the cleaning brush in there to clear the way. Set that down. And now you're left with this part of the airbrush. So the next step would be to actually clean this with none of the parts attached, which is when you're going to put a little cleaner on one of your mini spoolie brushes, and you can run that all the way through the airbrush. You can also plug the hole where the nozzle was, put a little bit of cleaner in the mixing cup, and then I like to hold a tissue underneath it and let go, and all of the excess makeup that was left in there will drip out of the nozzle hole. I like to make sure this is nice and clean before I put it back together. Make sure all of the parts are nice and clean before we put it back together, and you're going to work in reverse to reassemble your airbrush, but don't do so until everything is clean. Now, one other part I want to talk about that we did not take out of the airbrush, but it does need attention, is a part that's very hard to see. It's also often forgotten, and it's called the piston. And the piston is directly above the air stem, and it's a gold circle, a little gold disc that would be located directly underneath the trigger. And the way the piston works is it moves up and down very easily by allowing the air to come up through the air hose, through the air stem, and into the airbrush. If the piston gets stuck because it's not oiled, then the air will not efficiently come into the airbrush, therefore not able to push the makeup out. So even though you would feel air coming out of the airbrush, it would definitely not be to the amount of pressure that it should be. So I do recommend oiling your piston from time to time, especially if you find that you needed to clean back here in this area where your trigger was. Perhaps there was some makeup back there and you need to re-clean that area. So don't worry, our cleaning kit also has the lubricant. You would just put the lubricant right over that nozzle, squeeze 1 or 2 drops over the nozzle, and then I like to take the tail end of my tweezers and just push up and down on that nozzle to work the oil into the hole that it's sitting in. Now we're ready to reassemble the airbrush. So once you've disassembled and cleaned everything, it is time to put it back together. So while we're doing that, I do want to recommend that you do not disassemble the air stem attachment part of the airbrush. It's really not necessary to even mess with anything that's in there. And if you do happen to soak your airbrush in cleaner to give it a really good clean, please keep that part of the airbrush out of the fluid. So you would essentially, everything below my fingers can be submerged, everything above, not. Now, let's go ahead and start by replacing the piston, assuming that you did take the piston out to oil it. And you're just gonna wanna drop it in, kind of like the game of operation. Don't wanna be super shaky. Take the tail end of your tweezers to be sure it's in its proper hole. Once you've got it back together, let's work backwards. All right, we're gonna go ahead and reattach the nozzle. I recommend hand tightening it until you feel a little resistance. Take the rectangular notch of the wrench and slide that over the base of the nozzle. And then we're just gonna tighten it until you see the slightest resistance. Stop. Don't over tighten this. Remember, that gasket around the threading will do everything for you. Then we're gonna put the nozzle cap back on. That one can be screwed down tight. And then the needle cap. Okay, the front of the airbrush is assembled. Now it's time to put the trigger back in. So you're going to drop that in, give it a quarter turn, and be sure it is positioned right above the air stem and that it is pushing up and down on the piston. This is the needle channel. Remember, this is the item that has the little flap that will go in behind the trigger. So you will need to enter at an angle and then it will pop up right behind the trigger. Slide the spring on the channel. And then the needle casing, this part needs to be tightened down completely. And then we will go ahead and gently and very slowly insert the needle. If you feel any resistance, please stop. Somewhere that you could feel resistance would be if the trigger is not inserted properly, then it could stop the needle from entering the airbrush completely. So make sure it is definitely sitting in the notches and go ahead and very slowly push until you have about an inch out. Then you can go ahead and tighten down that needle chucking nut. I like to check by pulling that trigger back and making sure that the needle moves backwards with the trigger. And then the tail cap, and you should be good to go. I do recommend reattaching it to the airbrush hose and spraying a little cleaner through just to make sure everything's nice and ready to go.